Marcus Sinclair, Duke of Faircross, was 3 steps past his wife's chamber door when he heard her say his name. He stopped without meaning to. Pause. A year of marriage had taught him exactly 2 things about the quiet woman behind that door. She asked him for nothing, and she made almost no sound he could ever trace through the halls of his own house. He had grown so used to her silence that hearing his own name spoken softly, alone, at the edge of evening, felt almost like hearing a stranger. Marcus. She was not calling him. The door was shut. The room beyond it sat in the kind of hush a house keeps just before the lamps are lit. He should have walked on. He had walked on 100 times before. He was, in truth, the sort of husband who took a strange pride in walking on. He did not walk on. Through the door, in a low, steady voice, his wife Cecilia was praying. Not for herself. Let his arm trouble him less tonight, she said. He stood too long at the estate desk again this morning. Cold always finds the old wound first. Let it ease. Let him sleep without fighting it. Marcus's gloved hand pressed flat against the corridor wall. A candle in his other hand tilted. A bead of warm wax slid over his knuckle without his noticing. And let the news from the hospital reach him kindly, the voice went on, calm as someone tending a small, careful fire. He worries more than he lets anyone see. Let him not carry that worry alone forever. Marcus's breath caught somewhere between sentences. A hospital. No one in this house, not even his own steward, was supposed to know about the small veterans' hospital he funded quietly 2 counties away. One thing left from the war he had never told his own family. Let him be happy, Cecilia said simply, as though placing a fact gently into safekeeping. Let it not matter, particularly, from whose hand the happiness comes, only that it finds him. Amen. There was no amen for herself. There was no request for herself, anywhere in the entire prayer. Not one word. In 12 months of marriage, asking anything at all for the woman who had spent a full year in this house, being looked through, dinner, like part of the wallpaper. Marcus stood very still in the dark corridor, a duke who had crossed half of Spain and held a line, broken men, together, at Salamanca, with a musket ball still lodged near the bone of his right arm, and found that he could not make himself move from that spot. He had been a fool. He understood it all at once, the way a soldier sometimes understands the shape of a battlefield, only when the morning fog finally lifts. He had been a fool with great precision, for exactly 1 year, mistaking his own coldness for dignity. Before we go any further, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world. Cecilia's story is already pulling at your heart, and I know it is. Please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now, let's go back to the beginning and find out how a quiet country girl ended up married to a duke who would not even look at her. 1 year earlier, Cecilia Ward had been the eldest daughter of a modest country solicitor, with no expectation of ever marrying a duke at all. Her father had died suddenly the previous winter, leaving behind a small inheritance that should have been simple and safe, a tidy sum set aside for Cecilia's future, held in trust by her father's old business partner, a smooth, soft-spoken man named Alaric Pratt. But Cecilia did not know, and would not learn for many months, was that Alaric Pratt had already spent most of that inheritance on his own failing investments, and needed a fast, quiet way to make the missing money disappear from the books before anyone came looking. Duke's marriage proposal, arriving through a mutual acquaintance, solved Alaric's problem perfectly. Marry the girl off quickly to a man wealthy and proud enough never to ask too many questions about her dowry, and the gap in the ledgers would vanish into a generous new household, never to be examined again. While Cecilia sat by her father's grave each Sunday, still grieving, still trusting the man managing her future, in a cold stone house 2 counties away, Marcus Sinclair sat alone at his estate desk long past midnight, going through the same hospital ledger for the 3rd time that week. Also, while Cecilia packed a single trunk to leave the only home she had ever known, Marcus dealt quietly with his stepmother, the Dowager Lady Constance, who had begun increasingly open conversations with the family physician, suggest that the old war wound in his arm caused spells that made him unfit to manage Faircross at all. Spells that, if formally recorded, would let her own son step in as guardian of the estate. Cecilia could not refuse the marriage. Alaric controlled what little money remained to her, and a single woman, with no father and no fortune, had almost no power to refuse anything at all. Marcus could not explain his own urgency either. Not fully, not even to himself. He only knew he needed a wife, quickly and quietly, before his stepmother found enough evidence to convince a magistrate he could not be trusted with his own house. And a quiet, ordinary girl, far from London gossip, seemed the safest, simplest choice he could make. He never once considered, in arranging it, that the girl herself might be carrying troubles every bit as heavy as his own. The wedding itself had been small, cold, and over within 20 minutes. Marcus had bowed stiffly at the altar, said his vows in a flat, distant voice, and departed for his carriage without offering his new wife his arm. Cecilia arrived at Faircross Hall that same evening to a housekeeper, Mrs. P. Birch, who showed her to her rooms, with careful kindness and very little conversation, and a husband who did not appear at dinner at all. For the first week, Marcus visited her chamber exactly once, to ask, stiffly, whether her quarters required any further comfort. "No, Your Grace," Cecilia had said. "Thank you." He had not asked again. It was Mrs. Birch, gentle and observant, who first told Cecilia something did not add up about her new husband's reputation. The village called him cold, distant, even strange, since his return from Spain 3 years earlier, and yet, on her very first morning in the house, Cecilia had noticed a stack of unopened letters addressed to the Faircross Veterans Relief Fund, tucked beneath an ordinary pile of farm accounts on the hall table, as though someone wanted them overlooked. "His Grace does not speak of the war," Mrs. Birch said carefully, dusting a shelf she did not strictly need to dust. "But there is more kindness in this house than the family lets show, my lady. You will see it, in time, if you look in the right corners." Cecilia did look. Over the following weeks, in small, careful moments, a glimpse of Marcus pausing at the stable to check on an old groom's bad knee, a quiet word he had with a tenant family whose roof had collapsed in a storm. She began to notice a man who was nothing like the cold, careless husband the county described. It was during one of those quiet observations, watching from the library window, as Marcus stood far too long in the cold, examining a tenant's broken fence with his own hands, that Cecilia first noticed the way he favored his right arm, the way his glove never quite came off in company, the way he winced and hid it almost before it happened. She mentioned it carefully to Mrs. Birch one evening over the mending basket. "His Grace was wounded at Salamanca," Mrs. Birch said, lowering her voice. 3 years come this autumn. He has never let it heal properly, my lady, not in the way that matters. There is no surgeon in this county he trusts enough to ask." Something in Cecilia settled then, quietly, into resolve. She did not know yet what kind of man she had married, but she knew, already, that he was carrying more than anyone in this house was willing to say aloud, and that no one, in a full year together, had ever simply asked him how he was. What followed, over the next several months, was a slow, careful thaw that neither Marcus nor Cecilia fully admitted to themselves. It began with small things. Cecilia began ordering his breakfast tray exactly as the kitchen staff quietly told her. He preferred it, though he had never once requested it himself. She began leaving a fresh cushion at the desk chair in the estate office, angled just so for a man who favored one arm without ever saying why. Marcus, for his part, began noticing things he had trained himself for a year not to notice. The particular way Cecilia hummed an old country tune while arranging flowers, the faint thread of lavender that followed her through the halls, the steady, patient way she answered Mrs. Birch's questions about the household without ever once raising her voice. It was Dr. Faulkner, an old army surgeon, and Marcus's closest surviving friend from the war. He first gave Cecilia real information when he visited Faircross that spring. His Grace has refused proper treatment of that wound for 3 years, Dr. Percy. Over tea in the small drawing room, after Cecilia pressed him with careful, genuine concern. He believes a duke ought not show weakness, even to his own surgeon. I have told him 14 times that the wound will fester if left untreated through another winter. He has agreed 14 times and done nothing. Cecilia anchored the number, 14 warnings, 14 times ignored, and resolved quietly to make it 15, to make the 15th one finally land. That same week, Lady Constance, Marcus's stepmother, paid one of her increasingly frequent visits to Faircross, arriving with her usual cool smile and a folder of papers she described only as matters concerning the estate's long-term management. Cecilia, passing the open study door by chance, overheard enough to feel a small, sharp chill, a mention of formal evaluation, a mention of his condition since Spain, a mention of her own young son, Hugh, as a steadier hand for the family's future. It was the first crack in the quiet surface of Faircross Hall, the first sign that Marcus's silence and his stepmother's smiling visits were both circling the very same danger. That evening, Cecilia found Marcus alone in the library, staring at an unopened letter from the Veterans Hospital, his jaw tight in a way she had learned, over the months, to recognize as worry rather than coldness. "I think," Cecilia said carefully, setting down a cup of tea beside him without asking, "that your stepmother is not visiting for the good of the estate at all." Marcus looked up at her properly, fully, for what felt like the first time since their wedding day. "What do you know of my stepmother's visits?" he asked, his voice low. "Only what I overheard by accident," Cecilia admitted. "But I think, Your Grace, it is time someone in this house told you the truth plainly, instead of waiting politely for you to notice it yourself." What Cecilia learned over the next 2 weeks, piece by careful piece, was far worse than she had feared. Mrs. Birch, after much gentle persuasion, finally admitted what she had quietly suspected for over a year, that the family's man of business, a cousin of Lady Constance named Mr. Felton, had been managing the estate's outgoing accounts since Marcus's return from the war, including, it seemed, the funds Marcus believed were going faithfully each quarter to the Veterans Hospital. "I have kept these household accounts 41 years, Your Grace," Mrs. Wren Birch told Marcus directly. The day Cecilia finally brought her into the study to speak plainly. "I have never once seen Mr. Felton's entries match the bank's own receipts. I assumed, forgive me, that it was simply not my place to question a gentleman's arithmetic." It was Doctor, summoned again, under the polite excuse of examining Marcus's arm, who delivered the final piece, speaking carefully, with Cecilia present. "I attended your father 7 years before you went to Spain, Your Grace," Dr. Faulkner said quietly to Marcus. "I have watched your stepmother manage your family's affairs since you were a boy of 12. I will say only this. She has never once, in all that time, asked after your health out of simple kindness. She asks only when she believes the answer might be useful to her." That same week, working together at the estate desk, late into the evening, comparing Mr. Felton's quarterly statements against the hospital's own thank-you letters, line by line, Marcus and Cecilia found themselves leaning over the same candle-lit page, her finger tracing a column of figures, his hand resting, without either of them quite deciding it, close beside hers. "You have a sharper eye for numbers than my own steward," Marcus admitted quietly, watching her circle a figure that did not match the one recorded in the bank's letter. "My father was a solicitor," Cecilia said simply. "I learned to read a column of numbers before I learned to read most novels. It teaches you to notice, Your Grace, when something has been quietly moved that should not have been." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, something unreadable behind his tired eyes, and said nothing further that night. But something between them had changed. The silence was no longer cold. It had become the careful silence of two people, both afraid, in their own separate ways, of saying too much too soon. The proof finally arrived on a damp evening in early autumn, nearly 9 months into the marriage. Cecilia had taken, by then, helping Marcus quietly sort through the estate's older correspondence, searching for anything that might explain the gap between what the hospital received and what the ledgers claimed had been sent. Tucked behind a stack of unrelated farm invoices, she found a single folded letter in an unfamiliar hand, addressed to Mr. Felton, and signed only with the initial C. Her hands went cold as she read it by candlelight. The Duke continues to favor the wound and avoid proper treatment, exactly as we hoped. Continue routing the hospital's quarterly sum through the secondary account as before. If his condition is ever formally questioned by a physician of our choosing, funds can be moved entirely under guardianship before he is well enough to object. Cecilia read the lines twice more, then carried the letter straight to Marcus's study, her candle nearly blown out by her own hurried steps. He read it standing, his face moving slowly from confusion to something far colder as he reached the final sentence. Pause. I believed Felton merely careless, he said quietly. I never let myself believe my own stepmother might be waiting, quite patiently, for my arm to finish failing me. Who is C? Cecilia asked. Lady Constance, Marcus said, his voice flat with a terrible calm certainty. There is no one else in this house who signs her private letters with that single initial, out of habit, since she was a girl. The room went very quiet. Outside, the autumn rain had begun, tapping gently against the long study window. Marcus set the letter down on the desk between them, and when he finally looked up at Cecilia, the careful distance he had kept for almost a year seemed, all at once, to fall away entirely. I have spent a year believing dignity meant asking nothing of anyone, he said, his voice rough. I have watched you walk into this house full of cold rooms and colder silences, and you have not once flinched from any of it. I cannot promise you safety yet, Cecilia, not while Constance still believes she is winning, but I can promise you this. Whatever comes next, I no longer intend to face it without you standing beside me. Cecilia closed the small distance between them, her hand finding his. I did not come here to be safe, she said. I came here to be useful. Let me help you finish this properly. He looked down at her for a long, breathless moment, then leaned in and kissed her, slowly, as though she were something he was still half afraid might vanish if he moved too quickly. When he finally drew back, his voice was unsteady. I have wanted to do that, he admitted, since the evening you ordered my breakfast tray exactly as I like it, without ever once asking me how I take it. The peace did not last. 3 days later, Lady Constance arrived at Faircross without warning, her carriage sweeping up the drive as though she already owned every stone of it. Marcus, dear, she said smoothly, stepping into the drawing room with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. I have brought Dr. Conrix with me, a formal opinion, simply for the family's peace of mind, regarding your arm. Before she left that afternoon, Constance handed Cecilia a sealed letter, claiming it concerned a small matter regarding your own late father's estate that requires your immediate attention. Inside, when Cecilia finally read it alone that evening, was a forged statement, supposedly signed by her own father before his death, claiming Cecilia's full inheritance had already been transferred, years earlier, to cover a private debt of his own, a debt that, conveniently, matched almost exactly the sum Alaric Pratt had quietly stolen. It was a lie, built carefully to resemble the truth, and for one terrible night, it nearly worked. Cecilia did not show the letter to Marcus right away. Doubt crept into her like cold water, finding every old crack. If her father truly had spent her inheritance himself, and perhaps Alaric Pratt was not the villain she had begun to suspect. And worse, perhaps everything she had built with Marcus over these past months had been built on her own mistaken sense of being wronged, rather than any real injustice at all. She locked herself away for 2 days, refusing meals, refusing visitors, staring at the false letter until the careful handwriting blurred together. On the 3rd day, a folded letter was slid quietly beneath her door, written in Marcus's own hand. Cecilia, Mrs. Birch tells me you have eaten almost nothing in 2 days, and I find I cannot bear it a moment longer, so I am writing what I should have said to your face if you would only open this door. I do not know precisely what was written in the letter Constance gave you, but I know my stepmother, and I know she does not deal in truth when a careful lie will serve her better. Whatever it claims, I ask you to remember one thing. I did not begin to love you because of any dowry, real or imagined, and I will not stop because of one either. I married a stranger because I needed a quiet wife and a quiet life, and believed, foolishly, quiet was the same as peace. I have since learned to love a woman who taught me that peace and silence are not the same thing at all. You have given me back parts of myself I thought the war had simply taken. My trust, my patience, my willingness to be looked after by someone who asks nothing in return. I would have chosen you, even if your father had left you nothing at all. Even if every shilling of your inheritance had vanished into the sea. That is the truth, Cecilia, whatever Constance's letter claims. Please come downstairs. The house has been entirely too quiet, and I find I no longer have any patience for that particular silence. Cecilia read it 3 times before she finally opened the door. Armed with Marcus's letter and her own steady resolve, Cecilia brought the forged document straight to Mrs. Birch, and through her, to an old clerk in the nearby town who had once worked alongside Cecilia's father and recognized his true signature instantly. "This is not your father's hand, my lady," the clerk said within minutes, holding the forged letter up to the light. "Your father crossed his sevens. Whoever wrote this did not know that small habit at all." Marcus used that proof, alongside Constance's letter to Mr. Felton, to call a private hearing before the family's trustees and a county magistrate, held at Faircross Hall itself, with both Constance and Felton summoned to answer for the Fay missing hospital funds and the forged inheritance letter at once. Alaric Pratt, summoned separately, once his role in arranging Cecilia's hasty marriage came under question, broke first, confessing within the hour that he had spent Cecilia's inheritance on failed investments and arranged her marriage purely to bury the missing sum before anyone noticed. Mr. Felton, confronted with his own letter and the threat of formal charges, confessed soon after that Constance had paid him for over a year to quietly route the hospital's funds through a second account, all in the hope that a documented decline in Marcus's health would let her son inherit guardianship of the estate entirely. In the great hall at Faircross, before the trustees, the magistrate, and a small gathering of stunned household staff, Cecilia finally spoke the words she had been carrying since the cold morning of her wedding. "I was sold into this marriage to cover a debt I never created," she said, her voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "I have spent a year being called the Duke's quiet, forgettable wife, while quietly learning every secret this family tried to hide from itself. I have done nothing this entire time but tell the truth, care for my husband, and refuse to look away from what I found. Is that, in the end, truly such a terrible thing for a woman to be?" No one in the room answered her. No one needed to. Constance was removed from any further role in managing Faircross's affairs. Her son's claim to guardianship dismissed outright by the magistrate. Felton and Pratt were both left to face the full weight of the law for fraud, with Felton's confession sealing both their fates completely. And within the month, with Dr. Faulkner finally given full authority to treat the old wound properly, Marcus's arm, and, slowly, the rest of him, began to heal in a way it never had before. You have come this far, and that means everything to us. Stories like this one survive because people like you choose to carry them forward. If Cecilia's story has moved you, if it stirred something true inside you, this is the moment to act on it. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, like this video, to let us know it mattered. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a comment telling us what part hit you hardest. Now, let's see this through to the end. A year later, the old wound that had troubled Marcus since Spain had finally, properly healed, leaving only a thin, pale scar he no longer bothered to hide beneath his glove at dinner. Veterans Hospital, with its funding fully restored and its accounts placed under Mrs. Birch's careful eye, had grown enough to add a second small ward, paid for, this time openly and proudly, in the Duke and Duchess of Faircross's joint names. In the spring, Marcus and Cecilia held a small, quiet ceremony in the gardens of Faircross to renew their vows, far simpler than the cold church wedding that had first joined them. Just close friends, staff who had quietly stood by them both, and Dr. Faulkner, standing as Marcus's witness. That same week, they returned together to the very corridor where it had all truly begun, standing for a long moment outside the door of what had once been Cecilia's separate chamber, now joined permanently to his own. "We started here," Marcus said softly, looking down the familiar hallway, outside a closed door, both of us too proud and too afraid to knock. "Look how far we have come since." A little over a year after that, Cecilia gave birth to a daughter. They named her Verity, for the words Cecilia had whispered to herself. Alone in a cold carriage, on the very first night she arrived at Faircross Hall, certain she would never find a single honest thing inside its walls. Cecilia often told her daughter, as she grew, that the truest kind of love was rarely loud, did not announce itself across a crowded ballroom, or arrive wrapped in fine words. More often, she said, it crept in quietly, through small, unasked-for kindnesses. A breakfast tray remembered without being requested. Prayer, spoken softly behind a closed door, for someone who never expected to be prayed for at all. Years later, when she was old enough to understand the whole strange story of how her parents had truly fallen in love, Verity would only smile and say, "My father despised my mother for a year, without ever once truly knowing her. And the moment he finally listened, really listened, at her door, he never looked away from her again." And so the story of the quiet bride and the cold-hearted Duke came to be remembered, in the end, not as a tale of forged letters and stolen inheritances, but simply as the story of two people who learned, behind a closed door, at the edge of one ordinary evening, exactly how to finally hear one another. Thank you for staying with Cecilia and Marcus's story all the way to the end. If it moved you even half as much as it moved us to tell it, that means more than you know. Subscribe for more stories like this one, and we will see you in the next one.